Willow Creek was a quiet town, where most people spent their lives without much fanfare. The Reed brothers, Michael and Daniel, grew up surrounded by familiar faces and old traditions. Michael, the older brother, was always expected to go far. He excelled in school, made friends easily, and eventually became a lawyer, a solid, respectable profession that suited him. Daniel, on the other hand, was more reserved. While Michael was outgoing and confident, Daniel was quieter, preferring to spend his time reading or walking through the woods just outside of town. He became the town librarian, a job that suited him well. Though his life wasn't as exciting or impressive as Michael's, he was content. The brothers were close despite their different paths. Michael married Emily, a kind and thoughtful woman he met in law school. After they married, they moved back to Willow Creek, where Michael set up his law practice, and Emily worked with a nonprofit that provided legal aid to local families. Initially, their life seemed perfect. Michael's practice was growing, and Emily was involved in the community. They had a nice home, and from the outside, everything seemed to be going well. But as time passed, subtle changes began to creep in. Michael's work started to take up more of his time. He often came home late, tired and preoccupied. Emily, who had once been his partner in everything, began to feel the strain of his absence. The long conversations they used to have about their dreams and plans were replaced with discussions about schedules, logistics, and the mundane details of daily life. Emily didn't complain. She knew how important Michael's work was to him, and she wanted to be supportive. She immersed herself in her own work, finding satisfaction in helping others, but it didn't fill the growing void in her marriage. She began to feel lonely, though she wasn't sure if it was something to be concerned about or just a phase they were going through. Daniel, always close to both Michael and Emily, noticed the change in Emily before anyone else. She started visiting the library more often, initially just to pick up books or say hello, but gradually, their visits became longer. They would talk about the book she was reading, about the town, or sometimes just sit together in comfortable silence. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding that developed between them, two people who were both a little lonely, finding comfort in each other's company. Neither of them saw anything wrong with it at first. Emily and Daniel had always been friends, and their relationship was nothing more than that. But as time went on, Emily found herself looking forward to her visits to the library more than she should have. She enjoyed Daniel's calm presence, the way he listened without judgment, and the ease with which they could talk about anything or nothing at all. Daniel, too, was surprised by how much he enjoyed Emily's company. He admired her for the work she did, her kindness, and the way she seemed to really see him, even though he wasn't as outgoing or successful as his brother. But he kept his feelings to himself, aware that Emily was married to Michael, and that anything more than friendship was out of the question. The changes were subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Michael didn't notice at first. He was too busy with work, and when he was home, he was often too tired to see that anything was wrong. But Emily and Daniel both felt the shift in their relationship, even if they didn't want to admit it to themselves. One day, after a particularly long and stressful week, Emily found herself lingering at the library longer than usual. She and Daniel were talking about a book they had both read, and for a moment everything felt easy and natural, as if the worries of the outside world didn't exist. It was a small thing, really, just a quiet conversation in a quiet place, but it was enough to make Emily realize that she was at risk of crossing a line she hadn't even known existed. Daniel sensed it too. He didn't say anything, but there was a moment of silence between them, a shared understanding that whatever this was, it couldn't continue in the way it had. They both knew it, though neither was ready to confront it, head on. As the days passed, Emily tried to distance herself from Daniel, but it wasn't easy. The pull between them, born of loneliness and a deepening emotional connection, was strong. They both tried to ignore it, to go back to the way things were, but something had shifted and there was no going back. Michael was more absorbed in his work than ever. His law practice had picked up a few big cases, and the demands on his time increased. He was often up early and home late, leaving little time for anything else. When he was home, he was distant, his mind still occupied with work. He thought he was doing what was necessary to provide for his family, but in doing so, he was becoming more and more disconnected from Emily. Emily noticed the change in him. She tried to be understanding, reminding herself that this was just a phase, that things would get better once the work settled down. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, she began to doubt that things would ever go back to the way they were. The easy, carefree conversations they used to have were now replaced by silence or brief exchanges about mundane tasks. She felt increasingly isolated, and the loneliness that had started as a quiet discomfort was growing into something more painful. Despite her best efforts to keep busy, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She threw herself into her work, taking on more responsibilities at the nonprofit, but it wasn't enough. She missed the closeness she once had with Michael, the sense of partnership that had been the foundation of their relationship. Now, she felt like she was living with a stranger, someone who was physically present but emotionally distant. Daniel, meanwhile, was going through his own struggles. The quiet librarian had always been content with his life, but lately he found himself feeling restless. His conversations with Emily had become a highlight of his days, something he looked forward to more than he should. He knew it wasn't right, that he was treading into dangerous territory, but the connection he felt with her was hard to ignore. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that they were just friends, that there was nothing wrong with enjoying her company. But deep down he knew there was more to it. The unspoken tension between Emily and Daniel grew with each passing day. They both tried to keep their distance, to avoid anything that might lead them down a path they couldn't return from, but it was harder than they expected. They continued to meet at the library, though less frequently than before, and when they did, the conversations were tinged with a subtle undercurrent that neither of them could fully articulate. Michael, for his part, remained oblivious to what was happening. He was too wrapped up in his work to notice the small changes in Emily's behavior. He didn't see how she seemed more distracted, how she spent more time at the library, or how her mood seemed to shift, depending on whether she had seen Daniel that day. Michael assumed that any distance between them was simply a result of the stress he was under, and that it would pass in time. One evening, as Michael was working late in his home office, Emily sat alone in the living room. She had tried to call a friend earlier, but the conversation had been brief and unsatisfying. Now she found herself thinking about Daniel and the ease of their conversations. She missed the way they could talk about anything, the way he seemed to understand her in a way that Michael no longer did. The thought made her feel guilty, but it was the truth. Unable to shake the feeling, Emily decided to take a walk. The cool evening air helped clear her mind, but it also made her more aware of the emptiness she felt. As she walked past the library, she saw that the lights were still on. She hesitated, knowing that if she went inside it would be difficult to leave without talking to Daniel. But the thought of going back to the silent house was even more unappealing, so she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Daniel was at his desk, going over some papers, when he looked up and saw Emily. His heart skipped a beat, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. He hadn't expected to see her this late, and he wondered what had brought her here. Emily offered a small smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Daniel couldn't ignore. "I just needed to get out of the house," Emily said, her voice quiet. "It's been one of those days." Daniel nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. He gestured for her to sit down, and they fell into a conversation that felt both comforting and dangerous at the same time. The library was empty, the world outside quiet, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in existence. As they talked, the boundaries they had tried to maintain began to blur. Neither of them intended for it to happen, but the connection between them was undeniable. They shared more than they should have, confided in each other in ways that felt both natural and wrong. When it was time for Emily to leave, there was a moment of hesitation, a lingering glance that held more meaning than either of them was willing to acknowledge. They parted ways with unspoken words hanging between them, both aware that something had shifted once again. The tension that had been simmering was now closer to the surface, and they both knew that they were walking a fine line. The comfort they found in each other's company was becoming something more, something that neither of them could ignore much longer. The days that followed were marked by a quiet struggle. Emily tried to focus on her work, to keep her mind off Daniel, but it was impossible. Daniel, too, found it difficult to concentrate, his thoughts constantly drifting back to that evening in the library. They both knew that they were at a crossroads, that the choices they made in the coming days would determine the course of their lives. The tension was building. The quiet comfort they once found in each other now tinged with something more complex and potentially dangerous. And as much as they tried to deny it, they both knew that their relationship was changing, that they were moving towards something that could not be undone. As the days passed, the tension between Emily and Daniel became increasingly difficult to ignore. The comfortable companionship they once shared had turned into something more complex and laden with unspoken emotions. Both of them tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it was clear that their connection had deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Emily found herself spending more time at the library, using it as an escape from the growing distance she felt at home. Her marriage with Michael, once a source of stability, now felt strained and hollow. Michael was often preoccupied with work, his late nights and early mornings leaving little room for meaningful interaction. The house, once warm and filled with shared moments, had become quiet and lonely. Daniel, too, struggled with the changes in his life. He had always valued his role as the town librarian, finding comfort in the routine and the quiet that came with it. But lately, the presence of Emily in the library had become both a joy and a source of inner conflict. He cared deeply for her, more than he was willing to admit, but he was also acutely aware of the boundary they were approaching. The shift in their relationship was gradual, marked by moments that seemed insignificant at first, longer conversations, shared looks that lingered a bit too long, and a growing sense of reliance on each other's presence. These moments, though small, accumulated until the nature of their relationship had clearly changed. One evening, after another day of feeling disconnected from Michael, Emily found herself at the library once again. The walk there had become a routine, a way to clear her mind, but this time the visit felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between her and Daniel that things were no longer as simple as they once were. That night, the atmosphere in the library was charged with a tension that neither could ignore. The usual ease of their interactions was replaced with a sense of anticipation, as if they both knew that the dynamics had shifted and that something irreversible was about to happen. It wasn't a sudden decision, but rather the culmination of months of quiet, unspoken feelings. In the quiet of the library, their connection finally crossed a line. It was a moment of weakness, a brief lapse in judgment, but it was enough to change everything. The kiss they shared was not planned, nor was it something either of them had consciously pursued, but it was an expression of all the emotions they had been suppressing. Immediately afterward, the reality of what had just occurred settled over them like a heavy blanket. Both Emily and Daniel were filled with an overwhelming sense of guilt. They had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed, and the implications of their actions were daunting. Emily left the library that night with a heavy heart, the cold air outside doing little to clear her mind. She knew that her relationship with Michael was already strained, but now she had complicated things in a way that she hadn't intended. The guilt weighed heavily on her as she walked back to the house, unsure of how she would face Michael or even herself. Daniel, too, was left with a deep sense of regret. He had never meant to betray his brother, but in that moment, his emotions had gotten the better of him. The connection he felt with Emily, though powerful, was now overshadowed by the knowledge that he had crossed a line that should have never been approached. Both Emily and Daniel knew that their actions had changed everything. The fragile balance they had been trying to maintain in their lives was now shattered, and the consequences of their choices would inevitably follow. What had started as a simple friendship had now become something much more complicated, and there was no easy way to undo what had been done. In the days that followed, the weight of their actions hung over them, influencing every decision they made. Emily tried to continue her life as normal, but the guilt was a constant presence, affecting her interactions with Michael and even her work. Daniel, too, found it difficult to focus on his responsibilities at the library, his thoughts frequently drifting back to that night. The relationship between Emily and Daniel, once a source of comfort, was now fraught with tension and uncertainty. They both knew that they couldn't continue as they had been, but they were unsure of how to move forward. The emotional connection that had once been a solace was now a burden, something they both had to reckon with. Meanwhile, Michael remained unaware of the changes in his marriage. His focus on work had kept him distracted from the growing distance between him and Emily, and he had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. But the undercurrents in his household were strong, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. The quiet, everyday life in Willow Creek continued, but for Emily and Daniel, everything had changed. They were now living with the consequences of their actions, and the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with difficult choices. Emily tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at home, but it was clear that something had shifted. The guilt of her betrayal gnawed at her, affecting her interactions with Michael. She found herself avoiding his gaze, unable to reconcile her feelings of love and loyalty with the deep regret she felt for what had happened. Simple tasks became burdensome as her mind constantly replayed the events in the library. The moment she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Michael, still absorbed in his work, noticed the change in Emily's demeanor but attributed it to stress or fatigue. He was too preoccupied with his cases to delve deeper into what might be bothering her. The long hours he spent at the office had become a way to avoid dealing with the growing distance in his marriage, a distance he was only vaguely aware of. He told himself that once things calmed down at work, he would make more time for Emily, unaware of the true extent of her turmoil. For Daniel, the aftermath of that night was equally torturous. The sense of betrayal he felt towards his brother weighed heavily on him, and he began to withdraw from social interactions, not just with Michael, but with the community as a whole. He kept to himself more than ever, his usual routine at the library now tinged with an underlying anxiety. Every time he saw Emily, whether in passing or during her visits to the library, he felt a pang of guilt that was impossible to ignore. The connection that had once brought them comfort was now a source of pain. They both knew that they had crossed a line that could not be easily forgiven or forgotten. Yet despite the overwhelming guilt, they found it difficult to completely sever the bond that had formed between them. The emotional pull, though now tainted, was still there, making it harder to move on. For Emily, the strain of maintaining a facade became overwhelming. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. The guilt of betraying Michael affected every aspect of her life, leading her to avoid him and retreat into isolation. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the silence between them grew unbearable. Michael, sensing the distance but not understanding its cause, finally asked Emily if something was wrong. Emily, feeling cornered, confessed that she had been struggling with feelings of loneliness and disconnection. She stopped short of revealing the full truth about her connection with Daniel. Michael listened quietly, his mind racing. He had always believed their marriage was strong enough to withstand any challenge, but Emily's words left him questioning everything. He wanted to repair their relationship, to find a way back to what they once had, but the path forward seemed uncertain. Meanwhile, Daniel, burdened by guilt and the growing rumors in Willow Creek, decided it was time to leave the town where he had spent his entire life. He knew he couldn't stay in a place where every corner reminded him of his mistakes. Before leaving, Daniel wrote a letter to Michael. In it, he apologized for the ways he had let his brother down. He expressed his regret for allowing his emotions to cloud his judgment, and for the part he played in the distance that had grown between them. When Michael received the letter, it added to his sense of confusion and betrayal. Though Daniel hadn't explicitly confessed to what had happened, the tone of the letter made it clear that something significant had occurred. Michael began piecing together the fragments of what he knew: Emily's recent behavior, Daniel's withdrawal, and now this letter. The truth began to form in his mind, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to fully confront it. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly tense as Michael wrestled with his suspicions. He didn't confront Emily directly, but the unspoken tension between them was palpable. Every interaction was fraught with an unasked question, and the weight of what was left unsaid hung over them like a dark cloud. Emily, sensing that Michael was starting to piece things together, became even more anxious. The facade she had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. Eventually, the truth came out. Though not with the drama one might expect, it was more of a quiet realization, a mutual acknowledgement that their marriage, as it had existed, was no longer viable. The love they had once shared had been eroded by lies, guilt, and emotional distance. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, just a shared understanding that things had changed and that they couldn't go back. Michael and Emily decided to separate, both recognizing that staying together would only prolong the pain. The decision was difficult, but it also brought a sense of relief. Finally, there was a way forward, even if it meant going their separate ways. They knew it would take time to heal, but they were ready to begin that process. As they finalized their separation, Emily moved out of the house, leaving behind the life they had built together. She found a small apartment on the other side of Willow Creek, a place where she could start fresh and focus on rebuilding her life. The days that followed were filled with moments of regret and sadness, but also with the first hints of hope. Emily knew she had made mistakes, but she was determined to learn from them and find a way to move forward. Michael, too, began the slow process of healing. The separation was painful, but it allowed him to reflect on what had gone wrong and how he could approach life differently in the future. He threw himself into his work, not as an escape, but as a means of regaining a sense of purpose. Over time, he reconnected with friends and family, finding comfort in the support they offered. Daniel left Willow Creek quietly, in the early morning hours, saying goodbye to few people. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he needed to get away from the memories that haunted him. He hoped that, in time, he would find a place where he could start over, free from the mistakes of the past. The town of Willow Creek, always slow to change, gradually moved on from the events that had unfolded. The gossip that had once been so intense began to fade, replaced by the everyday concerns of small-town life. People still talked about the Reed family from time to time, but the story became just another chapter in the town's history, a reminder of how even the most solid-seeming lives can be shaken by the choices we make. For Emily, Michael, and Daniel, the road ahead was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility. They had each been through a difficult and painful journey, but they were also stronger for it. The past could not be undone, but it also didn't have to define their futures. They each had the chance to build something new, to find happiness again, even if it meant doing so apart from one another. In the end, life went on, as it always does. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer the focus. The Reed family, once so close-knit, had gone their separate ways, but they had also found a way to move forward. And in that, there was a sense of hope, a reminder that even after the darkest times, there is always the possibility of new beginnings.